Hello, space friends. Captain Snuggles here, back in X4 Foundations Beta 7.5. The beta has reached a point where the major bugs are mostly under control, so now I'm pivoting back to my specialty, which is quantitative analysis of game mechanics. This first video will focus on the beta's central update, its number one priority, the new flight model, as it affects player piloting. Not the new boost, not the propulsion rebalance, just the flight model. We won't be looking at AI piloting or at the player interacting with the game's content, just at the player flying their ship through space, how that experience has changed, and how those changes align with Egosoft's stated goals for version 7.5. Then, lastly, since this is a playtest, I'll provide suggestions on how that alignment might be improved. I'm going to start by providing an overview of how the new model functions in-game, as opposed to the old one. This is going to take some time, but I think it will be useful for my audience and for the devs. My audience for obvious reasons, and the devs because this is a detailed evaluation of how the flight model is actually functioning in-game, which they can hopefully then compare to how they intended the flight model to function in theory. Disclaimer: Beta 4 has radically altered the way deceleration works. The changes feel unpolished, so I expect further revisions in future betas. Nevertheless, in the interest of providing timely commentary on the current state of the game, I'm forging ahead with this video. I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Elliot Howley, a statistical consultant who has been a huge help in performing this analysis. You can find him on Twitter at the handle ElioHow, or just click the link in the description. The description also has a link to my raw data, for the devs and the data savvy among you. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Comparing the old flight model to the new, some of the biggest differences are in the functionality of Flight Assist, so that's what I'm going to focus on first. Flight Assist is primarily a deceleration tool. It applies force to counteract your momentum in certain directions. In the old flight model, Flight Assist would blast out enormous amounts of lateral, vertical, and rotational force to correct your momentum in those directions, which very quickly got your ship moving forward and only forward. Flight Assist Off was basically a 3D mobility mode in which your ship could drift and reorient freely, only resisted by a small amount of drag. Then, when you wanted to go straight, you turned Flight Assist on, you rapidly decelerated from your original direction of motion, and you went straight in your new direction. It was basically a linear flight mode. In the new model, Flight Assist is still a tool for deceleration, but it operates very differently. It does not offer anywhere near the same level of rotational, lateral, or vertical stability, meaning it no longer helps you fly straight, or at least not consistently. Instead, it has two main effects. First, when you're coasting with Flight Assist off, your ship will naturally decelerate only to its maximum cruising speed, and then drift indefinitely, whereas with Flight Assist on, your ship will automatically decelerate all the way down to zero velocity. The second effect is that Flight Assist normalizes the rate of deceleration. Deceleration with Flight Assist off is now extremely variable. It is partly affected by the baseline thrust of your engines and thrusters, as well as your ship's mass, but it also depends on a variety of unlisted stats of your ship and equipment, as well as your initial acceleration method, your deceleration method, and the direction you're traveling. Some of those relationships are intuitive, but many are not, and in combination they all add up to extremely unpredictable ship handling with Flight Assist off. With Flight Assist on, those relationships still exist, but there's less variation. Deceleration is normalized, making it much more predictable. The extreme high rates of deceleration are reduced, and the extreme low rates of deceleration are increased, favoring longitudinal deceleration over lateral and vertical deceleration. It essentially guarantees a moderate level of drift, especially lateral drift, at any speed, in any flight mode, whereas drift with flight assist off can range from fairly low to very high. Digging into the finer details, there seem to be two methods by which flight assist normalizes deceleration. First off, the acceleration curve itself seems to be a slightly different shape. With flight assist off, it frequently doesn't feel like much of a curve at all. The rate of deceleration changes abruptly, especially at the low end. Flight assist smooths out the curve, making changes in deceleration a bit more gradual. Based on what I've observed, that seems to be a fairly minor contributor to variation in the overall deceleration rate. The more impactful method of deceleration normalization is that flight assist also affects what I'm calling the thrust modifier, which is a multiplier that can increase or decrease the apparent thrust output of your engines based on the flight scenario. I say apparent thrust output because I have no way of knowing where in the flight model formulas the modifier is being applied. Regardless, it appears to the in-game observer as though extra forces are being situationally applied to your ship in a way that resembles a multiplier on your thrust output, so I'm calling it a thrust modifier. Now, how do we know that this so-called thrust modifier is being applied? Well, first off, there are a bunch of modifier stats in the XML files for ships and engines, and those must be going into some equation somewhere. Second, there's a mismatch between the acceleration listed on the ship info panel, the acceleration you'd expect based on the listed thrust of the engines, and the observed in-game acceleration. In many flight scenarios, none of them match. Sometimes two of them match, and only rarely do all three of them match. So, modifiers are being applied to make actual flight performance differ from theoretical flight performance. Drag does contribute to those modifiers, but it doesn't come anywhere close to fully explaining them, so it isn't accurate to refer to this perceived extra force as drag. It seems more accurate to call it a thrust modifier. When it comes to deceleration, the modifiers are usually positive. Observed thrust is higher than listed thrust, and the modifiers are usually different with and without flight assist. So, that seems to be the main source of variation in deceleration between flight assist modes, although I can't rule out the different shaped acceleration curves as a partial contributor. Regardless of the methods used, at the end of the day, flight assist has the effect of normalizing the rate of deceleration, making flight feel generally smoother relative to flight assist off. The exact effects vary between ships and engines, but that is the overall effect. That about does it for the general overview of the new flight model. In summary, its most dramatic effect has been to remove the old flight assist's duality of 3D mobility and linear flight. Instead, with flight assist off, we now have extremely variable deceleration and drift during maneuvers, coupled with indefinite slow drift while coasting. And with flight assist on, we have a normalized medium deceleration, medium drift flight experience. There have also been some secondary effects, namely an appreciable increase in travel drive maneuverability with flight assist on, a decrease in the added maneuverability from toggling flight assist, and a general increase in strafe speed, especially for capital ships, although that's hard to disentangle from the propulsion rebalance. Okay, overview over. We're moving on to the feedback section. I'm going to look at Ecosoft's stated goals for this flight model update, see how close it comes to achieving those goals, and provide suggestions for improvement. Looking at Ecosoft's 2025 roadmap announcement, they state that their goal for the flight model update is to make flying in the X4 universe smoother, more realistic, and more natural. They later say that the propulsion rebalance aims to make the most of these improvements, meaning the flight model update is intended to contribute to game balance, at least indirectly. When they said more natural, I assume they meant more intuitive, which is entirely subjective, so I will not be evaluating that goal. That leaves us with the stated goals of smoothness, realism, and balance, all of which have at least some component of objectivity that we can evaluate. We'll just take them in order, starting with smoothness. In the context of movement, the word smooth just means without jerks. In that respect, the new flight model is a mixed bag. It has decreased the power of toggling flight assist, which was a very jerky maneuver in the old model, so in that particular context, smoothness has increased. Additionally, during high-speed maneuvers in the old model, flight assist on generally felt more jerky than flight assist off, due to its tendency to quickly cancel out your lateral momentum and transition you back to linear flight. In the new model, flight assist off is the jerky mode, with its sharp acceleration curves and unpredictable thrust modifiers. Since flight assist is on by default, the new model does a better job of putting its best foot forward, exposing new players to the smoother flying experience first. For veterans who are used to having flight assist off for some or all of their maneuvers, this is either neutral or a downgrade in terms of smoothness, but it does seem to be an improvement for new players. My feedback is that the smoothness of the veteran experience would be improved by scaling back some of the harsh flight assist off deceleration spikes that have been implemented with Beta 4. Moving on to Egosoft's next stated goal, we come to the one that people really get worked up about: realism. There are a few ways to interpret the word realism in this context. There's true realism, there's in-universe realism, and there's verisimilitude. First, true realism, defined as the quality or fact of representing a person, thing, or situation accurately or in a way that is true to life. Does the new model represent spaceflight in a way that is true to life? No. Did the old model? No. They are both loose, partial approximations of Newtonian physics, not actual real-time physics simulations. Moreover, they both simulate physical environments that are not representative of space as we know it. The old model had drag reminiscent of a thin atmosphere, and in the new model, your effective thrust varies in ways that are sometimes reminiscent of flying through outer space, sometimes reminiscent of flying through an atmosphere, and sometimes reminiscent of flying through wet cement. You can argue about which system is more unrealistic, but neither one comes anywhere close to true objective realism. And that's fine, unless true objective realism was Egosoft's goal, which I seriously doubt. So, I'm going to move on to the second interpretation of realism, in-universe realism, or internal consistency. Internal consistency is not exactly synonymous with realism, but it's a major hallmark of fictional world building, especially in sci-fi. So the question is, in the context of the known physical properties of the X universe, do ships' flight characteristics make sense under the two models? With the old model, the answer was yes. Some version of drag exists, and so ships were designed to be aerodynamic, with the least resistance pointing forward, and a flight assist system to help them move in that direction. However, there is also zero gravity, which means it's possible to drift around and maneuver in 3 dimensions in ways that wouldn't be feasible in a planetary atmosphere, so the old model had the option to do that by disabling flight assist. In short, it was a system with 2 flight modes designed to take full advantage of different aspects of the physical universe. By contrast, the design philosophy of the new flight model seems to be that flight assist off is the problem, and flight assist on is the solution. On the face of it, that makes some sense. It's called flight assist, after all, so it seems perfectly appropriate for it to act as a stabilizer that somewhat normalizes ships' turbulent and unpredictable handling. It does beg the question, though, why is ship handling so erratic in the first place? The elephant in the room is the thrust modifier. Weak thrust sometimes produces a strong deceleration. Strong thrust sometimes produces weak deceleration, and sometimes player inputs functionally do nothing. It feels strange and inconsistent, and there is exactly zero in-game documentation to explain what's happening, which leads one to assume that there is no in-game reason for what's happening, which is harmful to the player's perception of internal consistency. So, I have 2 suggestions for improvement. First, adjust some of the extreme and incongruous thrust modifiers, such as the very low modifier on travel drive, the lack of additional deceleration thrust from the player's lateral thrust input as opposed to no input, and, again, some of the really harsh beta 4 deceleration spikes. Second suggestion, add in-game documentation to explain what's happening. It is extremely noticeable that your ship is moving in ways that cannot be explained by the available information. I've already seen people posting about this. Players are looking for answers and will continue to do so. So, give us some answers, even vague ones. For example, you could add an agility modifier line to each ship's encyclopedia page, and a braking modifier line for the engines, on a relative scale like 1 to 10. Just give players something to indicate that modifiers are being applied, that it's a design feature of ships and engines, and not just some sort of arbitrary space magic. That will also help with the third interpretation of realism, verisimilitude, defined as the appearance of being true or real. This is more of an impression of realism than any sort of actual realism. In other words, in this context, it's a spacey vibe. The new flight model's spacey vibe is superior to the old one, and the reason is simple. I'm no psychologist, but I feel pretty confident saying that most people subconsciously believe that if drift equals true, then space equals true. If drift equals false, then space equals false. The new model always has noticeable drift, whereas with the old model you had to disable flight assist to really start drifting. A lot of new players probably go dozens of hours without realizing they can disable it. So, especially for new players, the new flight model is going to instinctively feel more like spaceflight than the old one did. That said, I think that the decrease in internal consistency undermines the increase in verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is basically an illusion, and you want to maintain the illusion for as long as possible. The issue is that the lack of internal consistency will be noticed by many players, which will dispel the illusion of realism. So, my suggestions for improving internal consistency also apply to maintaining verisimilitude. That finally does it for realism, which brings me to Egosoft's last stated goal, improving ship and engine balance. Even without considering the actual propulsion rebalance that was performed, I think this is where the new flight model makes the most headway. Under the old model, most ship handling limitations could be bypassed using the flight assist system. The system mostly aligned with the laws of real-world physics, and it made perfect sense in universe, but it was too good at what it did. The ability to instantly transition from 3D drift into linear flight gave every ship an enormous amount of maneuvering versatility. So, with the new flight model, Egosoft have given themselves the opportunity to increase variety in ship design by adding a few new physics parameters, and at the same time, by reducing the power of flight assist, they are forcing us to experience the ships as they were designed. For example, the Katana is notorious for having horrible agility on paper, but that didn't make a difference for players before now. They could give themselves nearly infinite agility by just toggling flight assist on and off, with the occasional tap of the boost button, so they got all of the katana's insane speed with none of its agility drawbacks. Now, though, the katana's high-speed handling really is awful, and there's no way around it. You have to slow down if you want to turn at all. That seems good in theory, but my feedback here is that the controls and the UI are not well suited to fine-tune velocity like that. There's no indicator of your zone of maximum maneuverability like Elite Dangerous has. The keyboard throttle controls are sluggish. There are no keybinds for intermediate throttle settings. It's almost impossible to change speed in Travel Drive, and there's very little indication of your ship's velocity in any direction other than forward. I see the idea here, and I like it, but I don't think we quite have the right tools for the job. So it would be great if Egosoft could give us those tools. And finally, that's it. That's all of my observations, analysis, and feedback for the new flight model as observed from the player's point of view. Hopefully, all of that, plus my deceleration dataset itself, will help Egosoft improve the model with whatever time is left in the beta. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you'll tune in next time, and until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.